So hello to everyone, and thank you for taking the time out of your morning or afternoon to join us for the webinar today. We are excited to be joining Reverse the Red for their technical webinar series as part of the Year of Action, focusing on solutions, positive outcomes, and opportunities for collaborative conservation. In celebration of World Oceans Day, our presenters today will be discussing the need to integrate the conservation, restoration, and management of marine and coastal waters with freshwater and transitional waters. Over the course of this webinar, we'll share an aquascape approach that recognizes the codependence of these ecosystems and species that move between them, highlighting that to achieve real progress in aquatic conservation, we must acknowledge and address the ecological and socioeconomic connectedness of aquatic systems. The webinar today is building upon previous sessions that took place at the 2021 IUCN World Conservation Congress and also Impact 5 in Vancouver, Canada. The previous session served as a call to both adopt an approach where fresh and salt waters are conserved as a continuum, as well as an opportunity to start discussing the toolkit that we have available to implement this approach through the integrated management and governance of marine, transitional, and freshwater ecosystems. So today's presentations, we're going to continue to build upon this discussion, looking at ways in which the conservation and management of marine and freshwater ecosystems are connected through their species and habitats, and then also where the greatest opportunity to make the links between marine and freshwater conservation opportunities exist. Over the course of these presentations, reviewing commonalities in the design, establishment, and management of marine and freshwater protections, as well as lesson sharing to ensure connectivity and ecological function through the coordinated protection across aquascapes. Today, our presenters will look at the advantages gained by linking freshwater and marine protections with the potential to adapt guidelines for marine protected areas to the freshwater networks and settings. And we'll also be considering the health of freshwater systems, addressing challenges of polluted rivers, poorly managed biological resources to protect the marine systems which are so closely connected. By raising awareness for an aquascape approach, we are hoping that this session can help draw attention to the importance of freshwater issues as united components of IUCN's 2021 to 2024 program of work to integrate land, freshwater, oceans, and climate with people. So to explain a little about the structure of today's session, it will include 4 presentations followed by an open discussion on how we can best implement the ideas presented today. To help move through the presentations quickly and ensure we have plenty of time for the discussion at the end, we won't have questions after individual presentations, but we're trying to keep them short so that way there's time for discussion. So without further ado, I'm happy to present it to our first presenter, who is Amanda Vincent. Amanda is a professor at the Institute for Oceans and Fisheries at the University of British Columbia, Canada, and also a winner of the Indianapolis Prize, which is the world's leading award for conservation, and chair of the SSC Marine Conservation Committee. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to your slides, Amanda. You can take it off whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much. We're rather hoping, to be honest, that many of the points we make sound comfortable and familiar. And really, this particular webinar is about trying to generate some action for this joined up thinking. So, as Maddie just said, I chair the Marine Conservation Committee for the IUCN SSC. And I've come to realize, I'm still on the previous slide, please, Maddie. I've come to realize that saving the ocean really starts on land, and that freshwater ecosystems are crucial if we're going to preserve ocean health. So we're going to need to move energetically towards sea to source protected areas and sea to source management. The need to couple land-sea planning is, of course, pretty widely recognized, but actual execution of sea to source protection remains surprisingly rare. So historically, I think that most conservation managers have tended to decide on reserves and protected areas based on static measures like biodiversity presence and resource use, but we need to think a little bit more about connectivity and flow in these decisions that we make. Next slide. So I actually happen to be an expert on seahorses. So the question is, obviously, why do I in my professional life care about aquascapes and source to sea protection? Well, seahorses are coastal species that are deeply affected by what rivers bring to their seagrass, mangrove, coral reef, and seaweed habitats. And many seahorses are actually estuarine species, including our most threatened species of seahorses and the pipefishes, which I'm also deeply involved with. So the transitional waters, these estuaries and lagoons, are actually right between, if you will, the freshwater and marine. And one of the things we want to emphasize is that we have a freshwater conservation committee and a marine conservation committee and freshwater initiatives and marine initiatives, but we need to connect those through the transitional lagoons and estuaries. Also, I chair the seahorse, pipefish, and sea dragon specialist group. Many of our most threatened species are actually freshwater pipefishes, so we have to care about the continuum. Next slide, please. So there's a bunch of ways to look at this, and one of them is what happens if we don't have freshwater meeting marine. So one of the interesting stories is about the Colorado River. So if you look in the map, that's where Mexico meets the USA, top of the Gulf of California. And what you see is that I co-authored a paper in this area actually about the Upper Gulf of California Marine Biosphere Reserve, and it was established to support marine species, threatened totoaba, and which are a fish, and vaquita, the little porpoise. And what we began to realize is among the many management challenges, the Colorado River doesn't actually meet the sea here. Next slide, now click. And what you'll see is that that's the river flowing into the Gulf of California, but in fact, there is no flow anymore. The Colorado River doesn't really ever meet the sea. Next. So the Upper Gulf of California Biosphere Reserve is in the left-hand circle at the top of the Gulf, and the failure of the Colorado River to reach that area is in the right-hand side. So is it any wonder really that marine habitats here are very degraded, swinging from really a lack of salinity to overmuch salinity, adding pressure to the critically endangered vaquita and the vulnerable totoaba, which are also under huge fishing pressures. So we've got to have freshwater meeting the sea. Next slide, please. However, when we do have rivers meeting the sea, that of course brings challenges as well. So there are many instances indeed where it wreaks havoc. So one notable case is the Danube River in Europe. There are 19 countries sharing this river basin, and it meets the very enclosed Black Sea. The Danube River has contributed greatly to pollution and eutrophication in the Black Sea and caused dramatic shifts in phytoplankton species composition. It's also caused huge jellyfish blooms with considerable consequences for the Black Sea, not least for larval fishes, which fare very poorly in huge jellyfish blooms. So whether you have the river not meet the sea or meet the sea, its state and its status is really important. Next, please. And if you, next, please. And if you fix freshwater, it can really help the sea. So when we do take action for freshwater flows, the ocean can benefit. So this is Tampa Bay in Florida, the largest open water estuary in the USA. And thanks to rapid urbanization, industrialization, port activity, the bay was a mess in the 1970s with terrible eutrophication, among other problems. And the recovery, the very heartening recovery, is a long story and involves tremendous citizen activity and multifaceted initiatives. But the end result is a strong cleanup and really great habitat renewal with tremendous financial gains in ecosystem services. And the key, by the way, was clear metrics for program success and great community buy-in, plus this holistic approach that we espouse. Next slide, please. And then you also have the challenge where we talked about how the ocean needs freshwater, good quality freshwater, but also marine species actually can have a tremendous impact on freshwater environments themselves. So for example, in the case of salmon, the Pacific salmon in Vancouver area, where I live on the west coast of North America, actually migrate back up the river, and they bring a tremendous amount of marine protein with them. And that marine protein has been discovered to actually drive a lot of the forest well-being. And you find marine protein in many of the forest, the trees themselves, but also forest creatures. So we have this relationship between marine and freshwater that flows both ways to some extent. Next slide, please. So many marine species need aquasystem management. A great many species can only thrive if the source to sea system is intact. They have life cycles associated with fresh or brackish waters, and these are key to their survival. So for example, mangroves live on the interface between freshwater and marine, horseshoe crabs, manatees, many taxa. Lemon sharks and sawfish actually use mangrove areas as nurseries, and the pups remain in these estuarine areas for a long time while they're young. Bull sharks are thought of as marine species, but they're also upstream in major river systems such as the Amazon, even 4,000 kilometers away from the Atlantic. And there are sharks that only live in fresh brackish environments. So we really are going to need connected planning and protection to support the many species that migrate along these routes or live in a way that's dependent on good quality flows. Next slide. So it seems clear that marine species need healthy freshwater and estuarine environments with good ecological processes. So the question is, why do we have to have this talk? Why are we sharing the ideas with you today? Well, I co-authored a paper 21 years ago that made a case for whole watershed management in freshwater protected areas. And it's been astonishingly well cited, suggesting something in there was needed. And what I really argued that we needed whole catchment management and natural flow management, and the whole river continuum concept. And we're hoping that with this webinar that we'll extend this idea of a whole catchment management all the way from the source to the sea. Ideally, we'd like the idea to resonate with you in a way that you take forward. Next slide. So if we're going to do source to sea, what are the challenges? Well, one of the biggest challenges is going to be trying to create joined up management because different agencies manage different parts of this continuum and they don't really talk to each other particularly well. So we're going to need to find ways to bridge across these diverse bodies, these diverse agencies, so they can collaborate in actually looking at a holistic approach to water management and to the management of the species that live therein and the habitats that matter so much to us. So please take this as a call for integrated thinking when we're thinking about protection, management, and general well-being of our aquatic world. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Always great to see your presentation and hear your perspective. So our next presenter today is going to be Becky Flitcroft, and Becky is a research fish biologist with the U.S. Forest Service and is co-chair of the Freshwater Specialist Group of IUCN's World Commission on Protected Areas. Her research is focused on stream complexity and connectivity for aquatic species, and she's particularly interested in holistic approaches to watershed analysis and management. So welcome, Becky. Whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Thank you, Maddie. So we're going to transition from someone with a real marine focus to someone who has a real freshwater focus. But I tend to work with diadromous fishes, so fishes that move between freshwater and marine environments. And that's what we're going to be talking a little bit about today. Next slide, please. So often in our work, we focus on a terrestrial setting, on an ocean, on a river, on a piece of the landscape, on a specific watershed. And what we miss by looking at pieces and chunks of the landscape is the cohesive picture of how the entire system functions. This is the distribution of Pacific salmon. Pacific salmon use both environments and terrestrial settings, so freshwater, inland waters, and lakes. And they need estuaries, and they need marine environments. And they spend varying amounts of time in each of these settings. So let's move between them. So as we consider the management of these species, being able to consider how they're linked and how that entire aquascape is functioning is critical. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, the way that we manage much of our inland areas, our terrestrial environments, our estuaries, and our oceans is by disconnected and often siloed institutions and the science that informs practice and policy. This is something that Amanda was talking about right at the end of her presentation. Next, please. So by dividing the landscape, we make it easier for us to conceptualize it, for us to be able to apply research and paradigms for analysis and policy in a specific setting, but we don't necessarily serve those species that need to move between settings. And it's easy to forget that what happens on freshwater affects what happens in marine environments and vice versa. Next slide. The lack of connectivity in our thinking and our management, our policy and our science, I think, is part of what's translating into the biodiversity crisis that we find ourselves in today. So we are seeing declines across biota, with declines in freshwater environments being the highest compared to even to marine and terrestrial biodiversity losses. So as we start to consider the connections between habitats in freshwater settings, estuary and marine environments, it may be able to allow us to contribute to the recovery of biodiversity in places as well. Next slide. There's an effort to understand swimways. So we have migratory pathways for birds called flyways. And a few years ago, the World Fish Migration Foundation thought about swimways for fishes. So recognizing many times the very highly migratory freshwater fishes that are found around the world that rely on free-flowing rivers. Many of these migratory fishes stay in freshwater, but quite a few of them also move into estuary and marine environments as well. So it's that broader connectivity between inland waters and marine settings that becomes critical for the long-term resilience and persistence of many of our migratory and fishes that move vast distances. Next slide. There are three main forms of diadremy. So diadremy means two environments. So moving between freshwater and marine habitats, with estuaries, of course, being a critical part of that transition. There are three main forms of diadremy. There's an anadromous life history that was described a bit by Amanda and is often characterized by Pacific salmon. There's a catadromous life cycle and an amphidromous life cycle. In each of these life cycles, adults move from one environment to another, juveniles move from one environment to another in order to persist. One of the big differences is where spawning occurs. So for an anadromous life cycle, spawning occurs in fresh water. In a catadromous life cycle, spawning occurs in marine settings. And in an amphidromous life cycle, spawning occurs in the estuary. Next slide. For Pacific salmon, they'll spend different amounts of time across their life history in freshwater, estuary, and marine settings. So some species have spend about equal amounts of time in freshwater and marine settings like mussel salmon, whereas chum spend very little time in freshwater, and the vast majority of their time is spent in marine settings as they mature to maturity and then return to freshwater to spawn. But across all of these species, the connection between habitats is critical for them to be able to successfully complete their life cycle. The transition and movement between environments is often driven by phenological adaptations, both temperature and precipitation, river flow and patterns of salinity, sedimentation and food availability are all critical drivers of the migration and movement between environments that characterizes many of these very highly migratory fishes. Next slide. So how can we approach the protection of fishes that need to use both inland, estuary, and marine environments? Well, I want to share with you an example from the Oregon coast. This is Cascade Head and the Salmon River estuary. In this system, there are protections in place, riparian protections that are intended to afford the stream corridor itself with buffers from land use, which includes extensive timber harvest as well as agriculture and ranching that occurs within this watershed. The estuary has been protected and restored over time, and there's a marine reserve offshore that was deliberately sited to align with the protections that are in place in the system. Next slide, please. What's critical is that there's not just one protection, there's a mosaic of protections. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution to be able to capture the vulnerabilities of inland waters, estuaries, and the marine environment. So in 1974, the Cascade Head Scenic Research Area was enacted. It's the only scenic research area in the United States, and it was enacted by Congress. In 1976, the Salmon River Estuary and Cascade Head was identified as a UN Biosphere Reserve and is still identified as a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. In 1977, the Forest Service developed a management plan to restore the estuaries in the Salmon River system and the wetlands. And in 2012, the Cascade Head Marine Reserve was established offshore. So rather than thinking of this as a one-stop shop for protections across environments, I think we need to take a lesson from what's happened here and look at the diversity of protections that we might need. Next slide. So if we look at how this system functioned for fishes before the protections were in place, there was a very simplified life history. So the fishes moved through the estuary to the ocean. Next slide. After the restoration and the management that has protected estuary, inland, and marine environments, we've seen an emergence of a diversity of life histories as the fishes are now able to utilize habitats. These life histories have been identified both based on observed behavior, but also by looking at the otoliths, the ear bones of fish. If you shave an otolith in half, it's like reading the rings on a tree, and you can understand where those fish were at different times in their life history. And that kind of analysis has contributed to our understanding of the diversity of life histories that have emerged that are coincident with the protections and restorations that have been enacted in this system. Next slide. So how much of the world and the earth do we need to preserve and protect? Well, E.O. Wilson argues that we need half. Next slide. There's a lot of global conservation groups targeting 30% of the world's ocean, lands, and freshwaters to be protected by 2030. Currently, about 15% of the land on Earth and 7% of oceans are protected. It's unclear how much freshwater areas are protected. Next slide. But as important as the goal is, and we need to consider where we're providing those protections and what those protections exactly are. For example, this is a map of freshwater fish species biodiversity across the US, across the globe. And the green areas are key biodiversity areas that have been identified by local and some global groups. But you can see that many of our key biodiversity areas are not overlapping with where we have high fish species richness. This partially reflects that key biodiversity areas may not always be driven by fish richness. Next slide. So I'd like to thank you for your time and look forward to the next presentation.
Thanks, Becky. Appreciate it. So in the interest of keeping things moving along, our next panelist is going to be Ian Harrison, and Ian serves as the freshwater specialist for CI's Moore Center for Science, where he's helping develop Conservation International's freshwater strategy, as well as CI's broader institutional-wide freshwater initiative. He also serves as part of the steering committee for Species Survival Commission and co-chair of SSC Freshwater Conservation Committee. So go ahead, Ian, whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Betty. Okay, I'm going to present the results from a fairly quick and dirty analysis of the physical links between freshwater and marine systems and the need to address the conservation and protection of both of these systems together to maximize benefits for both. So next slide. And I'll kick off with a slide of Matt Gollock. So Matt's from the Zoological Society of London. He was due to be with us at this session, but he's been called away. And he presented this slide at a session of the last IUCN World Conservation Congress. And he uses an example of the importance of coordinated conservation as it relates to the species that he works on, which are eels. So here we have this river estuary. If you click on, Maddie. And now let's assume one branch of the estuarine delta is dammed, and this reduces the available habitat for the juvenile eels to migrate into, and that therefore reduces the resources and increases competition. So click on again. And this dam also concentrates juveniles, such that cormorants are more likely to be able to predate them, and so reducing the continental population. If you click on. And there's also intensive agriculture further up the catchment, which means that there's pollutant runoff and across the system, which eels are especially susceptible to. So click on again. And finally, there are fisheries for all life stages in the marine, transitional, and freshwaters in the system, and this will ultimately reduce the number of spawners. So dealing with only one of these components won't address the issues that eels and other species face, and so we must deal with them in a coordinated way. So next slide. So thinking more about how we can link freshwater and coastal conservation, including restoration and protection. Earlier this year, I played around with some data sets, and this shows the free-flowing rivers data set for rivers with a naturalized discharge of greater than 50 cubic meters per second, with the larger and darker blue representing greater discharge. And it's for rivers with a free-flowing status or a river stretch with good connectivity. So one could say that very generally, that the good connectivity status of these rivers means that they're good conservation opportunities, recognizing that it doesn't take into account other threats. And so the red spots on the map mark where these rivers meet the sea within 10 kilometers of marine protected areas. So these are areas of good connectivity connected to areas of marine protection. And I'm not quite sure why there are some red spots sort of in the middle of South America and Africa. I need to go back and check that. I have to say, it was a bit of a quick and dirty announcement. Anyway, so one will want to ensure that the rivers at these red spots are protected and well conserved, so that they don't have a very negative have a negative effect on the coast. And for example, if you have a marine protected area along the coast, but the river that feeds into it runs along a deforested area, then this could result in massive amounts of sediment flowing into over the coral reefs and the other coastal ecosystems that the protected area is meant to conserve. And so this will affect the habitat. It can affect the coastal fisheries, as we discussed for the eels, and it has other socioeconomic impacts, like affecting tourism and recreation around the marine protected areas. So next slide. Now, here's an example of that type of thing. It's the Guadalquivir River in southern Spain, which I believe has some protection in the upper part of the watershed, but it dumps a large amount of sediment into the Gulf of Cadiz. About 100,000 tons was estimated in 2008. And this sediment affects tourism and aquaculture. And there's a marine protected area right there in the Gulf, which you can see arrowed in the left image. And much of that sediment is coming from the upper part of the river, which also raises the point that the terrestrial protection around that river might not necessarily be doing a very good job of helping the river itself, depending on how the watershed is being managed. Next slide. So going back to the maps, if we zoom in on some areas as examples, we can see that we can see some conservation opportunities and where there are mismatches. And here you can see that the parts of the rivers where more than 30% of the upstream watershed is protected appear in light blue. And if you click on, we can see that there are free-flowing rivers that are also apparently well protected along the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua and Honduras that are adjacent to marine protected areas. And these are examples of good opportunities for combining freshwater and marine protection initiatives. Click on. But then if we look at Western and Central West Africa, we can see places where there are marine protected areas with free-flowing rivers flowing into them that don't appear to be protected. And so we want to see some protection of those rivers, and click on again. And if we look at the coast of Sierra Leone and Liberia, we can see a bunch of nice free-flowing rivers. It'd be great to coordinate the protection of that part of the coast along with the rivers. Next slide. And here's another example from Asia, and you can see just how many interesting free-flowing rivers there are, especially on Java and Borneo and Papua New Guinea. And there's some interesting overlap with marine protected areas, but there's also plenty that don't overlap. Next slide. And this map shows that relatively few of these rivers might have reasonable protection upstream. They're the ones in the light blue. And again, one feels that there would be great potential to create linked marine and river protected areas. Next slide. Now, I've just been showing you examples based on connectivity status, and of course there are multiple other threats to these rivers, and the Nature Conservancy have compiled information that has allowed them to classify a set of riverine last chance ecosystems, and those are systems that have a high level of integrity, but they're at risk from various threats, so they represent conservation priorities. And again, we can look at how these overlap with marine protected areas, so the red spots on the map. And next slide. And likewise, the Nature Conservancy has compiled information that has allowed them to classify a set of riverine crisis ecosystem occurrences. And these are systems that have poor ecological condition and low protection. And obviously there's a lot of these, which is no surprise given what we know about the state of freshwater biodiversity. And a lot of these freshwater crisis ecosystems meet the sea close to marine protected areas. Again, all the red areas. Next slide. And we can zoom in on a sample area that we looked at before, Central America, and we can see multiple examples of where we might want to focus action on freshwater protection to support nearby marine protection. But here it goes beyond just simple protection. It's these areas have been significantly impacted, so we need to think about restoration that will benefit the rivers and the associated habitats. So next slide. So the next step is really to do these analyses in a little more detail, and the information that comes from them will be very timely because several NGOs and initiatives have been thinking carefully about freshwater conservation, its restoration and protection as a result of the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And that includes guidelines on restoration for the Global Biodiversity Framework Target 2, with these two documents focused on wetlands and rivers. And if you click on here, if you want to take a screenshot, here are the links to these two documents. Next slide. And there are guidelines on protection for Target 3, and the QR code for accessing this document is on the slide. And next slide. And at the UN Water Conference in March of this year, we saw the launch of the Freshwater Challenge, which is a country-led initiative that aims to leverage the support to bring 300,000 kilometers of rivers and 350 million hectares of wetlands under restoration by 2030. And obviously, we need to identify where these restoration and protection efforts are going to be most effective and get the best return on effort. And so linking marine and freshwater conservation efforts are going to be very important here. And that's where we can apply these studies. And next slide. And this is an example. It's a project based on Socotra off the Horn of Africa, conducted by Kay Van Dam, who's part of the Freshwater Conservation Committee. And he's documented that many of the sensitive wadis the islands have become polluted, and he's observed dramatic declines in some of the island's surface water systems, and he's working very closely with local NGOs and communities to develop workshops and implement field surveys. And associated with this, he's mobilizing work on cleaning up the neighboring coastal sites, including a Ramsar site. So I mentioned this as an example of how easily and how well these integrated studies can work together, integrating from freshwater to marine, integrating across communities and local organizations, and including the government. Next slide. And so with that, I will close, but I'll be interested in discussing any of this further with anyone interested, and my email address is up on the slide. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Ian. So our final presenter for today is going to be Erin Lowry, and Erin is a fisheries biologist and science communications specialist with conservation experience in the Western United States and Southeast Asia. Erin has worked on projects to establish freshwater community managed fish conservation zones in Laos and Myanmar, and also standardized fisheries research methods and engage community participation in fisheries and research management. So over to you, Erin, whenever you're ready.
Great, thanks, Maddie. So I'm going to be talking today about how to connect those of us that work in marine environments and those who work in freshwater environments around this concept of aquatic protected areas. So I have worked on both marine and freshwater protected areas, and this presentation is drawing on work that I conducted with the fisheries consulting company FishBio. So next slide, please. I just first wanted to provide some context for the work that has shaped my perspective, which is working on freshwater protected areas in Southeast Asia. So these fisheries management tools are widespread in Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. They can also be found in Vietnam and Myanmar. And they're essentially discrete protected areas that are located in rivers, often around deep pools that are refuges for fish in the dry season. They can also be found in lakes and some wetlands. And the management structure is usually community-based or a form of co-management with responsibility shared with the government. And these tools are explicitly included in the Lao and Cambodian fisheries law, which provides a legal framework for establishing them. And fisheries management is often decentralized or even unregulated in areas of these countries. And that's, I think, why this concept of local spatial regulation has become so appealing. So next slide, please. And my colleagues and I were just struck by how few resources there were around the study and management of freshwater protected areas, and how little conversation and interaction there is between the freshwater field and the very established marine protected area field. So we convened a joint session at the World Fisheries Congress in 2016 with both marine and freshwater practitioners. And out of that, we wrote a review paper that synthesized different case studies, marine and freshwater, from 9 different countries. And we explored 5 different themes in this paper that I'll walk through each one in my following slides. So next slide, please. Oh, back, yeah. And so first, we just wanted to introduce this topic of, we're advocating for adopting some shared terminology that can help link the discussions happening in both the marine and freshwater environments. And so we proposed using an umbrella term to sort of link both of these fields of aquatic protected areas. And so by this, we are referring to spatially discrete locations in either marine or freshwater environments that are either restricting or prohibiting extractive fisheries. And so these areas might be closed temporarily or year-round, and often their goals are related to protecting or recovering fish stocks or achieving other aquatic conservation objectives. And in terms of freshwater protected areas, it's important to note that these are areas that are distinct from terrestrial protected areas. Next slide, please. So the first theme that we explored is the ecological system. And so it's clear that both marine and freshwater environments are very different ecologically. But when it comes to establishing protected areas, there's often a focus on protecting key habitats. And so we think there could be some opportunity to share spatial planning tools across the different realms. In particular, networks are important for the design of protecting migration corridors, either based on ocean currents or linear river channels. And as Becky mentioned in her presentation, diadromous fish that use both of these environments present clear opportunities for collaboration. Next slide, please. We next explored the establishment approaches for setting up new aquatic protected areas. And we found that there are similarities across realms in terms of the protected area governance structure. So in both marine and freshwater environments, you could find examples of top-down government-driven initiatives. You could find grassroots community-based initiatives and examples in between. And probably one of our largest take-homes is that these protected areas are usually established to regulate human behavior, such as fishing. And so there is this shared human dimension that unites both marine and freshwater protected areas that we think could be a key area for collaboration. For example, stakeholder engagement approaches are really crucial to consider from the beginning of any protected area establishment process. And in both realms, co-management can be a useful model, but it does require that communities have the legal authority to enforce regulations and usually require a good deal of government support in enforcing protected areas. Next slide, please. So then we next looked at the process of monitoring the effectiveness of aquatic protected areas. And here we found that long-term monitoring is much more established for marine protected areas, and there are fewer resources available for monitoring freshwater protected areas. However, in both realms, there is a greater emphasis on biological monitoring. So essentially looking at how fish and aquatic populations are responding to protection, which makes sense because that's often the stated goal of establishing these protected areas. But again, the protected areas are regulating human behavior. So there is a real human impact of these protected areas as well. And there are real data gaps for both socioeconomic and governance monitoring in both marine and freshwater protected area studies. So I think this is a really opportune example for collaborating across realms. In particular, it's because similar methods, such as surveys and interviews, can be used for collecting data on people, and it can be used to measure both socioeconomic and governance indicators in marine and freshwater environments. This is in contrast to biological monitoring, which usually differs across realms. So visual surveys are really common for monitoring marine protected areas, but those are only possible in the clearest of freshwater environments, and a lot of the rivers in tropical environments are highly turbid, and so fisheries gear is usually used to monitor freshwater protected areas in these locations. So next slide, please. We next looked at the process of sustaining aquatic protected areas into the future. So we noted there's a need to identify finance mechanisms to diversify funding for both types of APAs. And community-based management is often funded by donor funding, and can be a disconnect between long-term management goals and short-term funding cycles. And so in the push to establish new aquatic protected areas, there's often limited funding for monitoring and strengthening existing ones. And while aquatic protected areas can help some communities diversify their income through tourism, for example, there were much more examples of this in the marine environment. Next slide, please. Finally, we looked at challenges and external threats that face both marine and freshwater environments, and both marine and freshwater protected areas are subject to impacts beyond their borders. So whether that's development or upstream impacts. And so here there's a real need for this catchment scale approach to management and integrated spatial planning that other folks in the session have talked about. There are also some large-scale existential threats to both types of protected areas, whether that's climate change or mainstem hydropowered freshwater environments. And so it's important to be thinking about both of these types of tools as adaptable, maybe not necessarily static entities, but things that need to evolve and change. And finally, there are issues such as illegal fishing and poverty of local communities that emphasize that we need to be addressing sort of the human needs around aquatic protected areas, and that while enforcement within the protected areas is one piece, that alone can't address some of the larger issues affecting fisheries beyond their borders. So next slide. So some final take-home points, regardless of salinity of their environment, aquatic protected areas share some fundamental concepts that can encourage, I think, collaboration across these realms. There's great unexplored potential for exchange, particularly along the human dimensions of aquatic protected areas. I think adopting some shared terminology can help us bridge the realms and facilitate discussion like what we're having today. And I think this continued dialogue and exchange will be really important. So considering things like these cross-disciplinary webinars or conferences and workshops, writing inclusive journal articles together, and collaborating in networks and joint committees. So next slide. So that's all that I have, and I think we'll be moving on to our discussion portion. Thank you.
Thanks, Erin. So I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen and invite all the panelists to come back on video. So the remainder of the time is available for discussion questions. And if there's any main points or ideas that people have moving out of this webinar, please feel free to contact any of the presenters or myself, and I can direct you in the right direction. And the recording for this webinar will also be posted to YouTube and on reversethered.org by the end of the week. So if there's any colleagues that you had who were interested in listening to the presentations but couldn't make it today, that resource will be available to them. So I am happy to start us out with a question. But before I do, Megan, have we had anything come in the chat? There you go. So then, yeah, why don't we start it out with Rebecca? Like, you had a question. if you could share a little bit about, are there marine fish species that migrate between continents or between oceans that are similar to some of the species that you share?
There certainly are. What's really interesting is the boundaries and the definitions for place that people apply by defining different continents that really don't apply to our biota, that move between environments. So, there's a vast number of highly migratory marine species. I think whales might be one of the best examples of some incredible migratory marine species that move between oceans, for sure. As climate is changing and as ocean currents are changing, I live here on the Pacific coast of the United States, and we're starting to catch tuna that normally live on the Asian side of the Pacific Ocean. So there's a lot of migration and movement within marine settings and environments as well.
Thanks, Becky. Then Amanda, you also had a question that came up in the chat, and it was asking for some clarification how you're able to trace marine protein in the forest inland.
Well, thank you. Yes, I mean, it's a wonderful story. It's not actually my work, I'm sad to say, but Tom Remken at the University of Victoria in Canada is one of the leaders on this work. And they use the relative ratios of isotopes for nitrogen and carbon in the material that they gather in the forest. And the relative ratios of isotopes in those two elements actually can be useful in understanding trophic structure. So they can look at that ratio and know that it's marine derived. I can put a paper example in the actual chat. And I was very interested to find that not only is marine protein incorporated into trees themselves and forest plants, some of it transported a long way away from those headland streams by eagles and bears and other predators that have moved the salmon around the catchment. But also now they're even finding the marine carbon in the leaf litter invertebrates. So the entire ecosystem is deeply influenced by the migration of Becky's salmon. So it's a wonderful story, and I can post a link. Post a link to a Scientific American story that summarizes it, just as a quick entry point, because it really does remind us that the salmon originate in the stream, the migratory salmon of the Pacific, and of course of the Atlantic, and then they return the ocean that nourished them back up to the headwaters of the stream, ready for the next generation.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, and if you don't mind sharing the link to the article in the chat, I'd be interested to see that as well. So then, before I open it up with one of my questions, Mani, would you mind introducing yourself since you just jumped on?
Yes, I was going to go and potentially kind of make an intervention, because who is this other person who suddenly turned up? So I'm Moni Boehm. I'm the Freshwater Conservation Coordinator at the Global Center for Species Survival at the Indianapolis Zoo. And I'm really happy to be here on this panel. The Indianapolis Zoo's Global Center is essentially a new collaboration with the Species Survival Commission. Our job, my job, for example, as the Freshwater Conservation Coordinator, is to support the various specialist groups under the IUCN Species Survival Commission in their work. And really, these presentations were super insightful for me. I loved all of them. Erin's particularly really kind of hit home because of this, finding these commonalities when we come to talk about freshwater and marine protection and what we need to do for these systems. And this is really something that, although my role is Freshwater Conservation Coordinator officially, something that we're trying to implement here at the Global Center. And I think we're kind of setting out on the right path. We've got different coordinators for different taxon groups, but also, as in the case of me, for freshwater, but also for marine, to support the marine specialist groups and conservation committee under the IUCN. And really what we're trying to do is link these two roles up and start really talking about aquascapes right here from our office And then from here, hopefully much better across the Species Survival Commission and their specialist groups. So Erin's talk really hit home, and I'm really pleased to have now finally seen it since I missed impact.
Thanks, Mani. It's great to have you on the call. So to open up, I was curious if, and this is directed to all the panelists, over the course of these presentations, they've really shown that there's a need to think more inclusively about aquatic protections, bringing freshwater and marine together. But coming out of today, what really are the next steps in taking these ideas forward and making them real? What do you see as being the appropriate way to implement action on the ground?
I'm happy to quickly jump in with the first thought on this, and I think it's just it's to build on what Moni was just saying, that kind of the actions that that she and her colleagues have been sort of driving from the Global Centre for Species Survival in terms of working across biomes within the commissions, but also within IUCN. Actually, is something that we really need to do more of. I think there are kind of silos within IUCN in terms of how people work, where they're working, and just creating more of a discussion through this kind of thing is going to be super important. So I'll just say that.
I'll also add that I think for any of us, just reflecting on, whatever our niche is, whatever area that we're focused on in whichever system, it's trying to identify who is the counterpart that is working on that same issue across realms. So if we're in freshwater and working with communities, who's working with communities in the marine system or working more at the government level, I think kind of identifying who those counterparts are is one of the first steps for trying to break down those silos and figure out how can we bridge across.
I'll jump in with a little bit. I think whenever we're hosting any sort of gathering, which is to talk about marine or transitional or fresh waters, we should make certain that we invite people from agencies that are in the opposite. So if we're dealing with a marine question, let's make sure we have friends and colleagues from freshwater and transitional waters in the room so that the influence is always broadly felt. And wherever possible, we need to bring different management agencies together so that we actually can build the bridges, because it's surprising how little contact there often is between freshwater and marine management and policy experts. And I guess my final plea is that we really remember these transitional waters, because the estuaries and lagoons commonly fall between the two stools. We have freshwater experts and marine experts, but we need both desperately for the transitional waters. And I think that's a lot of where things break down in trying to understand this continuation, this continuum of challenges, but also of solutions. We cannot compartmentalize our challenges or our solutions. And so I think it's telling that this webinar has its origins in the International Marine Protected Area Congress, where we decided explicitly to bring in discussions about freshwater so that marine people would have to really consider how their paradigms could be useful and how much they needed to broaden their thinking.
Did you want to add to that, Ian?
Well, I'll wait for Becky to go first. Okay, all right. Well, just to mention also that we do have this, the Ramsar Convention, this great opportunity, a convention that works across wetlands from the coast to inland. So we have a great resource there to actually to bring this forwards, and I think we just need to kind of make the most of that and do what we can to help Ramsar do what it is there to do. So that's a real opportunity for us. So I'll just add that.
And I was just going to add that I think a really critical component is bringing our publics along with these conversations about the important connections between freshwater, estuary, and marine environments. I think Erin's project did a really nice job of demonstrating that. And it was the local community that drove the protections at the Salmon River Estuary that I described in my talk. You know, that was driven by people in the community who were interested in creating a diverse network of protections for their system. So, you know, I think that those grassroots efforts are enormously effective and are an important part of how we piece together broader patchwork quilt, really, of protections across land and sea.
Thanks, Becky. So building on that, it was a common theme in quite a few of the presentations, and then you just mentioned it now, the idea of community-led efforts in grassroots conservation. So amongst the presenters, how important do you think this will be in achieving successful conservation of aquascapes, and any strategies or ideas for the best way to integrate and make sure communities are involved in the work?
Maybe I'll start. I mean, communities are obviously a centerpiece in that they're proximately associated with the waters and their resources and their conservation. At the same time, I think we're going to need to work on all levels for these enterprises, because government actually holds the legal authority for what happens in most cases. And so what we need is the connection of intimate knowledge, local knowledge, traditional knowledge, and indigenous knowledge with the policy and management framework, so that we can get joined up thinking. If you like, there's another flow that actually needs to happen well. And while we often talk about top down or bottom up, but just as we talk about freshwater and marine and need to think about estuarine, so I think we top down and bottom up, we need to think about the middle layers. And I would encourage us to put a lot more effort into municipal work, regional work, provincial work. In many parts of Asia where I work, particularly say the Philippines or Indonesia, the actual authority rests with municipal governments. And I think we pay perhaps too little attention to the fact that they can bridge beautifully between community and provincial or national. So whenever we're thinking about any form of conservation, we need to really get into this joined up management and avoid falling into the top down, bottom up camp, just as we need to avoid falling into the marine and freshwater camp entirely.
I'll add that I think in the freshwater realm in particular, community management can be a really valuable tool, because the fisheries are often very dispersed over wide areas. There aren't really central landing points for monitoring and management. But as Amanda noted, you know, communities do need support and resources in order to effectively conserve their local areas. From a conservation perspective, I think it's also important to recognize there might not always be a match between the areas with high conservation importance and communities that have strong governance and desire to conserve. And sometimes it's needing to find the sweet spot where you know, there is that community motivation, and also you know, that the areas that are of, you know, sort of conservation importance.
I can just quickly add that something that's I think is interesting and very important is, as we're thinking forwards about how we do protections, especially right now that we're, you know, we have the global biodiversity framework out there that needs to be implemented, and the kind of work that I know Erin has done in terms of going beyond just protected areas, but community managed areas, community protections and other protection mechanisms, which aren't just sort of fencing an area off and saying this is protected, but managing it is going to be really important for our opportunity to expand our protection network. And to do that, those kinds of extra protections really are based on the knowledge and the expertise and the input of the people who are living right there. And so I think that's where the kind of the grassroots part is going to become really important, just to have a broader spectrum of aquascape protections.
Thanks. So on a similar vein, we did have a question come in on the Facebook chat, and it was an inquiry about how many large cities are located near big rivers. And the individual asked the questions located in Portugal and gave the examples of Porto and Lisbon. And if building on that, then how can we deal with planning in protected areas that give continuity between source to sea, but are still able to account for people and the needs that they have from the ecosystem?
Well, I think I gave the example of Tampa in Florida. Tampa is an extremely large city, several million, and is on a very shallow, large bay, which is moderately enclosed. And as I mentioned, had made a real mess of things. But by citizen mobilization and clear targets with adherence religiously to a particular metric they were seeking, they managed to mobilize for effective change by nudging just everything, nudging the way that fertilizer was transported, nudging the point source pollution to the bay and so on, and managed to make the change. So I think that cities, of course, impose a lot of pressure on our waterways, but at the same time, there certainly are good examples of remedial action once the fire is lit in regions. And to the basic question, it's, I think, 32 out of 33 of the world's major metropolitan cities, the ones over, 10 million, 5 to 10 million, are situated on areas where rivers meet ocean for historic reasons. So we do need to be very cognizant of the fact that these cities have influence for better or for worse. But also, as Ian pointed out, there are tremendous numbers of rivers meeting oceans where we don't have that huge metropolitan pressure, even though we always have human pressure. And so those can also be opportunities for us to set up models of good management that can spill over. One of the things is, I think, also to emphasize just the ecosystem services writ large that are provided by joined up marine, estuarine, and freshwater environments.
And I mean, there are obviously many other examples around the world of, where there are big cities, often in transitional areas. I was previously living in London, couldn't get any more transitional than the Thames estuary, linking marine and freshwater. And I mean, the Thames at some point was considered biologically dead. Obviously, some things still were clinging on. And while, of course, there's a lot of pressure on the system, things are now being put in place to actually make this system flourish again. Flourish maybe in a different way than it was prior to all of this, but there are exceptional species that you can find in the Thames estuary. When you tell people about it, they will never have thought that this is species that actually kind of live in this very densely populated by humans environment. So it is possible if we just put the right systems in place and the right actors together and start cleaning up our act.
Always good to hear the stories that show that progress is possible and there's a way forward. So recognizing that we are a little bit over the hour, and I'm not sure if any of our presenters have to jump off for future meetings, I'm going to open the floor if there's any closing remarks from any of the presenters to go ahead and share. And I'd be curious if it's possible to integrate into your closing ideas, recognizing that there's a pretty broad representation among this group of the different IUCN specialist groups, and seeing that being a potential opportunity to start to bring individuals working in different silos together. If you could share a little bit about what you think the IUCN's role is in moving this forward.
I mean, Amanda, do you want to go first?
Go on, Moni. Got it.
I mean, I think from my perspective, I feel like I should jump off this call soon and get stuck in all the work that we need to be doing, because I feel reinvigorated by these talks. But I think the IUCN's role is enormous in this. We have at our fingertips really all the expertise really in the world on what the problems are that we need to solve for aquascapes. And I think what has been standing in our way so far is that, yes, we are often siloed. It's also often that This is what people do, you know, as alongside their normal work. And so just joining people up is difficult because people have so many other things to be doing, right? So our job really is to break down these silos. Silos really can only go so far, generally to the edge of the silo. That's when you then bounce off, and that's as far as you can make progress. And I think really what we now need to do, and we have the full opportunity to do this because we've got all of the important players here, is just to bridge this. Break down the silos, talk more often. Whenever you think oceans, think freshwater, think transitional. Whenever you think transitional, vice versa. You get the gist. And as Amanda said, if we just start thinking about inviting the our equivalents in the other realm to all of our discussions, then I think we're really starting to create this aquascape approach. And hopefully maybe in some years' time, nobody will even think of these silos anymore. It's just aquascapes, and that would be awesome.
And I'll just add to that in terms of thinking about IUCN action. So IUCN has its resolutions which are put forward at every Congress, and there are a good number of those which address marine and freshwater issues, and those are calls by IUCN member organizations that are kind of mandating IUCN to do things. And those are opportunities for us, I think, we need to look at those resolutions, look at what they're calling to be done, and see how Commission members, IUCN member states, IUCN member organizations can mobilize those requirements for action. And as I say, there are a good number that do talk about integrating freshwater and marine actions.
Yeah, and I mean, the IUCN is 1,450 member organizations, roughly, of which 225 are state members, approximately. That means they're government agencies, not to mention about 100 Indigenous organizations. So the IUCN is by no means a private club. It's extraordinarily global and has a tremendous reach. So when we talk about resolutions for the IUCN that are meant to guide all those 1,450 member organizations, that should have a very broad catchment. So it is really important that IUCN member organizations be brought in on these discussions and start to espouse and embrace them as well. When the last World Conservation Congress from the IUCN came around a couple of years ago, we tried to promote a resolution on aquascapes, and we're told that nobody knew what an aquascape was, therefore it really couldn't fly. So we're hoping by these discussions that at least we demystify the new term aquascape, so that there is a willingness to recognize that this has considerable capacity to mobilize that very large suite of IUCN engaged people.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks. That is a great kind of final word that gives us something to work off of. So huge thank you to all the panelists and for everyone who attended today. This is one in a series of technical webinars coming up throughout the year through Reverse the Red, and the next will be on important plant areas in July. So feel free to check out their website to get the information for that, and then also the recording for this session. So thank you to everyone.
Thanks, Maddie. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.